If you had to pick the single most important site in Irish history, I think you can make a strong case for the Hill of Tara. For thousands of years, this was the ceremonial heart of ancient Ireland. 5,000 years ago, it was a sacred burial ground. But by the Iron Age, it was the island's capital in all but name, because this is the place where the High King was crowned. And it might also hold a clue as to what happened to Clonycavan man and old Croghan man, the two victims that we met in episode 1. Now, these were two Iron Age men of some importance. One had this remarkable hairstyle held together with exotic resin that came all the way from the Pyrenees, and the other had these incredibly long arms and perfectly kept fingernails. And we finished the episode with a simple question. Why would two clearly powerful men kneel before their killers and accept such a brutal end? To try to answer this question, I've come to Tara, the ancient capital of Ireland. Welcome to the Discovery series, The Bog Bodies. I'm Fionn Davenport. In this episode, we're going to widen the lens a bit. We want to understand why Clonycavan man and old Croghan man were killed, because their deaths didn't happen in a vacuum. They were too deliberate, too violent. To do this, we have to try and get some understanding of the Iron Age world in which they lived. What was everyday life like? What did they believe? What was important to them? Which brings us to Tara. And the best person to help me understand how important Tara was for all those thousands of years is Margaret Brady of the OPW, who's been guiding people around this sacred site for a long time.
If you go to visit a city, the place of worship, regardless of what your place of worship is, a cathedral, a synagogue, a mosque, whatever it is, that's the place that stands out in that area. And it is no different for the Neolithic people. Building these monuments, building them on hilltops, the higher you go, the closer you are to the deities, to the gods. And the fact that the kings chose the Furra, the highest point on the site, for their inauguration of their kings, they obviously had that same sense that the higher they went up, the closer they were to the deities, because there was that bond as well with the kings where they are wedded to the people, but they're also wedded to the gods and the goddesses. And they chose the hilltop for that.
If Tara was the seat of power, how did it connect to the rest of the country? And what kind of relationship did the High King have with the wider community? Was he an all-powerful monarch, or was he something else entirely?
Ireland been divided into about 150 kingdoms, and a king ruling anything from a couple of dozen people to a couple of thousand people, depending on where you live. All very rural, parochial. We live within our family, within our clan. We trade with each other, we fight with each other, and you've got a chieftain, you've got a king. And kingship at Tara elevated you over every other king in Ireland. It didn't mean you had a physical control or power over them, but you had a higher status. The Ardnaree, the High King. So the king of Tara was the king of the world as such. And he had the ear of the gods, he had the ear of the people. And then they lived by that code of ethics, that fearful harm, the justice of the ruler, where they were peaceful and righteous, truthful, honest, and physically perfect. Such a tough time to be a man.
Was that status, was that accomplished through conquest? Was it accomplished through agreement?
It was certainly accomplished through agreement, where other kings looked to Tara. Tara had the ceremonies, it had the inaugurations, it had the Feis Chemro that was held every 3 years. Samhain being a particular time here at Tara when different celebrations are held. And then, of course, Bealtaine, that big one at May time, and then that being when St. Patrick introduces Christianity, and we straddle that pagan-Christian divide. So yes, certainly Tara has that status nationally, yeah.
When Margaret talks about every other king, she's talking about the network of chieftains and leaders of each individual Tua, who had their own strict hierarchy and order. I asked Eamonn Kelly, former keeper of antiquities at the National Museum of Ireland, to break down this hierarchy for me.
Many of these Tuas assimilated together to form bigger Tuas, and they're operating then under regional kings or provincial kings. So you have the local aristocracy, and then you have the aristocracy as you go up the grades, to the provincial kings, who in ancient Ireland really were the big wielders of power in Ireland. The kings had to ensure that they were getting paid the taxes that are due to them in terms of agricultural produce and so on. So the king is responsible for the economy of the people as well. So it was probably a very busy job,
Do we know how even local kings were chosen by the Tuatha?
Yeah, we have quite a deal of information. Well, essentially, it was a limited franchise and they were elected. But very often, the kings would already have a nominated successor who was called a Taoiseach. So that's where that term comes from. That wasn't invented for Dáil Éireann. The Taoiseach was the next king in line. King in waiting is what he was. And indeed, the kings had their Taoiseach, but they had to be acclaimed by the people at the inauguration site. And it's interesting too that the kings got inaugurated standing on a burial mound, because they claimed, of course, that these ancient mounds were their ancestors, and if they were an interloper or a fraud, the ancestors would rise up and declaim them,
The notion that your dead ancestors would declaim you for getting it wrong is a pretty grim one, but it is central to how Iron Age societies were structured. And if all roads led to Tara, it's also pretty evident that the seat of power would have played a role in the lives of Clonycavan man and old Croghan man. Clonycavan man didn't live that far from Tara, 30 kilometres or so. And while Croghan Hill is a bit further away, it's not inconceivable that they may have come here. They may have stood on the hill and taken part in whatever ceremonies or gatherings happened at the time. Meanwhile, Margaret and I had come off the hill and we were now in the visitor centre, housed in a deconsecrated church with these beautiful stained glass windows by Evie Hone. I asked her if she thought our two victims had travelled here.
Absolutely. And during the feasting points and the celebration festivals at Tara, people would have come from all over. It is like people making their pilgrimages now. People came from all over. Certainly at Feis Chemro, that was held towards Samhain. They came for these celebrations, they came for assemblies, and it would have been frowned upon for people not to have made that journey. So people are moving within the country. They would have been making deals, they would have been making alliances, breaking alliances, connecting families, that whole fostering system where prominent families fostered, traded family members with each other. So there was less chance of you attacking me or me attacking you if I had your son or your daughter. And a lot of them would have been reared within those families. And then it was a way of creating an alliance, and then they may have married into that family.
Tara may have been where the big ceremonies took place, but what was day-to-day life like for people in the Iron Age? I asked Dr. Rena Maguire from Mary Immaculate College in Limerick and Queen's University Belfast to help us imagine the rhythms, routines and realities of their world.
It's only really recently that we've only even started to get a hold of what an Iron Age village or settlement would look like. They're actually remarkably sophisticated with their farming. There's introduction of crops.
And sorry, when you say introduction of crops from, so seeds brought from continental Europe?
From Britain as well.
Such as?
Well, we know now that they were certainly importing dates to eat from the end of the Iron Age at Dromana this year. They found date stones. Yeah.
Which would have come from
the Mediterranean.
The Mediterranean.
Yeah, exactly. You would have been working constantly with what was in season. People would have been eating seasonally. By the time that the autumn comes, would have been the time in which the spare animals would have been slaughtered. There would have then been smoking of them. And these people were extremely adept at preserving meat and fish. And that would have done for quite a while until things started to grow again. But certainly they're growing emmer wheats. By the end of the Iron Age, there is growing of flax, with flax seeds as well. There's oats. And we know that they, of course, are relying heavily upon dairy product, and also pigs. If there was one thing that you would say more than anything, eating pigs is the big thing. You've got wonderful artisans who are making objects of incredible skill.
It's clear that life in the Iron Age was a busy one. There was always something to do, and people were far from cut off, swapping goods and ideas as part of everyday life. We know about the resin in Clonycavan man's hair, and now we've learned they were also getting their hands on dates from the Mediterranean. And according to Dr. Jacqueline Cahill, visiting fellow at the Royal Agricultural University in Cirencester, exchange with the wider world wasn't a footnote at all, but a defining feature of Iron Age society.
There was immense trade and movement of people in the Iron Age and into the Roman period. People moving out of the way of the Romans. And people forget that when the Romans were pushing forward, people were getting out of the way. And I think probably a lot of contact happened in Ireland because it was never formally occupied by the Roman legions. And it could be that we have connectivity there. And the late, great Professor Barry Raftery, he coined a phrase that stuck with us for a long time. And he used to refer to, the Iron Age people of Ireland as the invisible people. We couldn't find them. We couldn't find their settlements. We couldn't make those links that we could even for earlier periods. We had far more demonstrable archaeology for, say, the Neolithic period or the Bronze Age, a lot of which we have in Ireland. But we now have an amazing collection of data. And what that tells us is that trade was perhaps more commonplace from the seacoast of Ireland to Britain and Wales and down to France and on to Europe. It would probably have been easier to get across the sea than it would have been to cross the great swathe of the boglands in the Midlands and then through that massive Shannon Basin and through more bogland to get to the west of Ireland. So connectivity between those living on the east coast of Ireland was probably more commonplace with their European and British counterparts, if you see what I mean. We think of the sea as a barrier. For them, it was a motorway.
I'm getting a stronger sense of the Iron Age world now. Far from being cut off in the northwestern corner of Europe, this was an island that was pretty connected to the world around it. Is it so unreasonable to assume that Clonycavan man and Old Croghan man weren't just important, but more sophisticated than I might have thought? Well, they may have been sophisticated, but they still met pretty grisly ends. So, how did our two urbane victims end up in the bog? Dr. Rena Maguire has some theories. One of them draws on the writings of the Roman historian Tacitus, who left us some of the earliest accounts of Iron Age Britain and Ireland.
Tacitus, in his book The Germania, actually writes that this is the end of people who have exhibited cowardice in the face of battle or have been aberrant in some way to society. And we do know that certainly the Germanic tribes are executing and putting in bogs people who do veer away from what their society is, women who give birth outside of marriage or infidelity. And then you've got some of the bog bodies are purely by accident. There's one in the Netherlands, I think it is, who is riding blind drunk across a bog, falls off his horse with his pockets full of money. We presume he was gambling, and he drowns. And it's as simple as that. It's death by misadventure. But Clonycavan, Old Croghan, their deaths are very, very deliberate. There's a modus operandi. Certainly, Old Croghan meets a particularly nasty end. There's the cuts, the withies that are placed.
I'm going to quickly interrupt here. Old Croghan man was found with withies, thin, bendy willow rods that were threaded through cuts in his upper arms. It's one of the strangest details about him. Because these weren't bits of clothing or decoration. They were put there deliberately, almost like handles, which hints that he may have been tied up, restrained, or even displayed before or after he was killed.
There was a theory at the beginning that that was to place the arms behind. However, it could equally be that after death, they like to put a screen of hazel upon the bodies and then stake down within the bog. Now, it's been hypothesised that the example had been made until the body sunk. People could go along and see them and say, see, if you aren't careful, you'll end up like that. With these two particular bodies, it's as if they are not wanted anywhere, which would lead me to believe that either they are prisoners of war, which is possible.
As in, these were men seized from other clans and then executed.
Could be. If you didn't want, they could be leaders of enemies of other clans. It's a possibility. They could be people who did something really bad. Or again, maybe we're right back to Tacitus. Are these cowards? Are these people who didn't lead their men into valiant battle?
For Jacqueline Cahill Wilson, another possibility exists, at least in the case of old Croghan man. Remember in episode 1 when we talked about how long his arms were? Well, that wasn't just an odd anatomical detail. It tells us he was a very tall man for his time, and that particular physical trait may not have worked in his favour.
With old Croghan man, we estimate his height at about 6'6", which is extraordinarily tall for that period where people were about 5'5", 5'6", from what we can gather. You know, I was thinking about this and his height and his extraordinary height, and a paper came to mind that was published back in, I think it was about 2019, about a protein, an anomalous protein, and all of the people who have this anomalous protein, which results in what would commonly be termed as gigantism, you know, overly tall, 6'8", 7 foot tall, even over 7 feet tall. And I wonder if that was seen as an aberration, so that something was wrong with him, that he was touched in some way with the gods, that he kept growing, and that may have led to what happened to him.
I find the idea that they may have been prisoners or cowards, or that one of them was killed simply because he looked different, strangely unsettling. I want their deaths to carry more weight than that. These are reasonable explanations, of course, but they feel shaped by how we see the world. What if their deaths belong to a much older way of thinking, one that sits just beyond the edge of our understanding, even though we share so much with our Iron Age ancestors? For Jacqueline, that's the key to unlocking this mystery.
As archaeologists, as historians, as people who are trying to understand the ancient past, we have to try to think ourselves back into the landscapes that these people saw and lived in, their lived experience, if you like. And the land and the connectivity to the land is something that a lot of us have lost. We have to try and strip out all the technological and infrastructure distractions that we have if we're standing in the landscape today. Strip it all away and imagine yourself, think of yourself standing in or around these large, vast, flat, open areas of bogland with huge skies as far as the eye can see, in a world that was essentially very, very local to these people. And then try to think of how special they must have felt at a time when we didn't have mirrors. We didn't have ways of looking at ourselves and reflecting ourselves back to us in the Iron Age. And these bogs were full of still, dark pools from which you could see yourself. And they must have thought they went on to the other world, so to speak. So their bondedness, their attachment to the land, and the need to ensure that the harvest was good, that people were fed, it's very primal. And I think if we try to think of it like that, we can understand why all the stories of ritual kingship and the health and well-being of the king being so important. You know, we have records of kings who could no longer be kings because they were hurt in battle and they were damaged. Kings had to be at their absolute prime, and chieftains as well, in order to ensure the health and safety of their communities. It was that simple. And had these people broken in some way that link that ensured the health and prosperity and safety of their people, I think that ultimately could have led to their demise.
This idea adds a whole new layer to the story. If you became a king, you had power and privilege, but you also took on full responsibility for more or less everything. If a harvest failed or sickness spread, then that was on you. So, is it possible that old Croghan man and Clonycavan man weren't just high-status men, but actual kings? Kings who paid the ultimate price because they hadn't ensured prosperity for their people. I find it difficult to wrap my head around that kind of responsibility. It just feels like they were always at the mercy of forces over which they had absolutely no control. But for Eamonn, this sense of responsibility had an otherworldly quality.
In the tradition of kingship, the king essentially was the earthly representative of the sun. And the earth was represented by the goddess, by the territorial goddess. And it was the union of the earth and the sun. As every farmer knows, that's what produces the crops. And you have all the traditions, all the festivals and so on are built around the farming year and farming practices, including the traditions of kingship. Basically, the king marries the goddess, and he then takes on the role of ensuring that the goddess remains benevolently disposed towards the people. And if circumstances suggest that that's not the case, if you have a cattle plague or your crops fail or you're invaded and people are taken off to slavery, then the king takes personal responsibility in an Irish context.
Okay, this is where things take on a really interesting turn. The idea of a king being married to the goddess of the land feels miles away from how we think today. But back then, if the land was healthy and thriving, the marriage was solid. If things went wrong, a bad harvest, sickness, anything, the king was blamed for breaking that sacred bond. And when that bond broke, the king could be removed, usually with violence. So could that explain the violence done to our two men? Both were deliberately mutilated. Both suffered injuries far beyond what was needed to kill them. Jacqueline thinks we're on the right track.
The rituals themselves seem to follow some form of triplication, which is, 3 different types of assault on these bodies before they were put into the ground. Triplication occurs a lot in the Iron Age, and specifically, you might know of the Corlech head from County Cavan, and it's got 3 faces on it. And don't forget, there was a lot of influence between the population groups at this time that we get triplication in imagery from the early Roman period, which is just after the Iron Age. But it's that idea of life, death, and rebirth, and that it was some sort of ritual associated with passing through these phases of life. Triplication is important. The fact that there is this 3 ways of death that seem to have been inflicted on both of the bodies.
This concept of triplication, also known as the triple death, has really stayed with me. Both Old Croghan man and Clonycavan man showed signs of this, with injuries far beyond what was needed to end a life. It's one of the biggest clues that their deaths weren't random acts of violence, but something ritualistic and very deliberate. Whatever the real story is, one thing is clear. Being a king in the Iron Age was no easy gig. You carried enormous responsibility, and half of it was completely out of your control. Standing at Tara, I felt like I edged a little closer to what it must have been like for someone about to take on that role. Those final moments before becoming king, knowing everything that title demanded and all the consequences it carried.
This is the walk that the kings would have made when they are going up to the Fora for inauguration. This is one of the last monuments to have been built at Tara. And if you imagine that land rises over time, originally this ground level was lower and the banks on either side were higher. And they scooped out what's in here and created these banks out of them. And there are gaps in the banks on either side. And over to the east, they were looking over to Newgrange, Nouth, Douth, Hill of Slane, to the west, Lochcrew, Ishnock. So all of these other hilltops, all of these other burial grounds on the horizon, that is what they are looking at. Making that walk up, kingship was not for life. Kingship was for as long as you kept the gods and the goddesses happy and the people happy. So they're walking with all that on their shoulders as well.
So just to kind of describe, we're walking up a slight incline, and what is a pathway that's roughly 30 feet, maybe 40 feet wide, and the banks on either side are maybe 8 feet high, 10 feet high. So you can clearly see this is a delineated path that's leading upwards.
Yeah. And they're making this walk with all the pressure, with all the responsibility that comes with kingship, knowing that there's no lineage, knowing that there's no succession, and that eldest son does not automatically follow father, knowing that the person that has been chosen, i.e. them, has been picked because they are deemed to be the ideal candidate. So they are now otherworldly as such. They have the ear of the gods. There must have been a huge amount of noise, chanting, celebration, sense of occasion as they're coming up this way.
And of course, every king that walked up that path knew what he was getting in for. He knew that he was taking on the ultimate responsibility and that the price of failure was usually death. And if that feels brutish to us today, it's because we're looking at it at the remove of a couple of thousand years. And yet, just like we heard No French talking about in episode 1, Dr. Rena Maguire has sat with the bodies herself, and she has a very clear sense that despite our divergent worldviews, there are clear parallels between us.
When you look them in the face, you're looking at us. They were people that walked about, had hopes, fears, dreams, ambitions, had bad tempers, bit their nails, whatever. They were exactly like us. The religion that they followed was different, but they are still us. And I sometimes find it incredibly sad that because of whatever people believed in, these young men were put to death in such a grisly way for whatever the belief system was. And they would have known it was coming, and they would have known what to expect. And I find that rather sad.
Maybe Old Croghan man and Clonycavan man died because of tribal warfare or as a punishment for cowardice. Maybe they were singled out because they looked or behaved differently from others in their clan. But maybe there's something deeper going on, something rooted in a worldview we no longer share. A supernatural element we struggle to grasp today. And to even begin testing that idea, we need to understand the belief system of the time, the gods they honoured, the places they held sacred, and why these things mattered so much. We have to let the science sit alongside the myth and allow a little of the old magic to seep back in. Coming up in the next episode of the Discovery series, The Bog Bodies,
the veil between this reality and the other world, it thins. And so people can communicate with the other side, or spirits or entities can cross over from that.
Both had their nipples removed. And that's a very definitive thing, saying you will not rule in the afterlife. We have just snookered you that you're going to be wandering about the afterlife in this bog. It's a serious form of othering.
We think of them as being covered up. Perhaps they weren't. Perhaps their resting place was a known pool in that bog where people returned to revisit them.
Ireland has plenty of ancient sites that you can explore from the Neolithic age right to the early Christian period. To find out more, go to discoverireland.ie.